The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome to Restoration Radio. I am your host, Heiner, and today we are covering the legacy of Joseph Ratzinger. We are joined today by His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn of Most Holy Trinity Seminary. Thank you for joining us, Your Excellency.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Father Anthony Cekada, St. Gertrude the Great, Catholic Church in Ohio. Thank you for joining us, Father.
Stephen. Nice to
Father
be here.
Today, thank you. Father today has just launched a new site because Father apparently has lots of free time on his hands, which he doesn't actually. But he's just put together a site that aggregates all of the different work that St. Gertrude is doing, and you can find that at sggresources.org, and I'll mention that again later in the show. So today we're going to be talking about the years from let's say anywhere from 1960, the council, and probably a little bit before the council, leading up to 2005, which was the last conclave. And we're going to try to look at the proposition that all Novus Ordo Catholics bought into. I certainly did at the time, that Joseph Ratzinger was this great conservative. I remember being a teenage Novus Ordo Catholic and looking to Cardinal Ratzinger as the real hard line, and that if only people could be like Cardinal Ratzinger, then the church would be saved. And for anyone who's continued to do their own research or look at this topic a bit more, they're going to find out that that's not only far from the truth, but it's probably completely the opposite. So for those of you who don't know our guest, His Excellency was ordained by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in 1975. Is that correct, Your Excellency?
Yes.
And was consecrated a bishop in 2002 by His Excellency Bishop Robert McKenna. Father Cekada was ordained in 1977, I think. Is that right,
That's
Father?
correct. Mm-hmm.
And he is yet to be consecrated a bishop because he's busy doing other things. So we'll start, Father. I think we were talking a little bit about the pre-show about some of how Ratzinger got started, let's say intellectually, what his roots were. Can you start us by speaking a bit about that?
Sure. It's important to understand his background, particularly because so many people have the idea, as you did, that he was a great conservative or a great traditionalist. Actually, his intellectual background comes out of modernism, ultimately. He was educated in Germany after the Second World War, and his professors were followers of a movement called La Nouvelle Théologie, the New Theology. And the idea behind the New Theology was to reject standard Catholic theology, which was expressed in Thomism and neo-scholasticism, and to come up with something else more in accord with the ideas of the modern world and modern philosophy. So he was very influenced by this thinking. And if you look back at his record, you see that the professors he was interested, he was educated by, were very much rooted in this as well. So he came to a point where he rejected what he called this rigid neo-scholastic Thomism and bought into this new theology.
Yeah, this is a time also when the new theology had tremendous impetus after World War II. The late 1940s, it blossomed and flourished in all of the Catholic institutions to a greater or lesser extent, even in the Roman universities. You had people who were avant-garde, and for example, John Paul II's thesis in the Angelicum was rejected by Garrigou-Lagrange, who was the primary and best representative of the old scholasticism, and he rejected it as modernist. There's another example of it. It's all the same period, the post-war theological period. So people should understand that both of these men were products of the same time. And you had the upsurge of Teilhard de Chardin and various other, perhaps lesser well-known people, theologians as they're called, coming up at this time. It was just their moment. Also, there was tremendous upsurge of the liturgical movement, the modernist liturgical movement. 1948 is the establishment of the commission by Pius XII to reform the liturgy, with none other at its head than Bonigny, who we found out to be, just the monster of liturgical reforms.
Sure. So these ideas were very, very much in the air. Now, if you hear the term modernism in connection with the theology during this period, you tend to think that it's a term that's applied by conspiracy-minded trads such as yours truly. But when you actually look at some of the later writings that have come out recently about this new school of theology, you see that those who are in favor of it very much draw the parallel between modernism and this new theology as one movement. In fact, there's a book on the new theology by a Belgian named Jurgen Metpenningen, who speaks of the movement of the new theology as the inheritors of modernism and as the precursors of Vatican II. And so this was the climate of intellectual modernist theological ferment that Ratzinger came out of.
And His Excellency mentioned the thesis of John Paul II, but I think also the thesis of Ratzinger at the time also got him into trouble.
Yes, it did. In Germany, apparently to teach at a university, you have to do two theses. One is your regular doctoral thesis, and then the second thesis that you have to do is the one that qualifies you to teach as a professor. So Ratzinger did one on St. Bonaventure. The man who was one of the men who was his mentor, Father Leppel, gave a series of recollections about Ratzinger as a student, and of course naturally had high praise for him. Leppel recounted that Ratzinger's thesis, in fact, ran into trouble because some of the auditors and the examiners thought that what he was proposing was something that was essentially modernist. So in the first review of the thesis by the dogmatic theologian Father Schmaus, Ratzinger, one of the comments was that Ratzinger, in the first part of it, was essentially teaching some ideas that were modernist. So what he did is Ratzinger went back and he did away with the first part of the thesis and submitted the second part of the thesis for an examination. But when the time came for his examination, the public examination and the questioning, there was a dispute over Ratzinger's idea of the truth. And this dogmatic theologian, Schmaus, asked Ratzinger, more or less, if according to him the truth was something static and changeless or something historical dynamic. And he couldn't get Ratzinger to answer. So Schmaus fell into a dispute with one of the other theologians there. And the question was never really answered.
So he was probably still out at sea at that time. He hadn't developed a substantial anchorage idea.
No, he was definitely anchored. That's in his book Introduction to Christianity, that whole thing about truth. He speaks about the scholastic idea of truth and, of course, discards it. And he talks about the modern the view of truth in modern philosophy. And he cites particularly Vico, who was a 17th century Italian modern philosopher, who said that truth is necessarily attached to action, that something is true for the modern man only if it is accomplished and done by him. And therefore it takes truth out of the realm of the objective and what is to the realm of action. This is typical of the modernists. This was Blondel as well at the turn of the century, that something is not true unless you put it into action.
Yeah, that's probably why you get all of the language at this time that talks in the modernist theological circles. It speaks about salvation history. Mm-hmm. Because there's this idea all the time of action.
Yes, yes. So that's definitely Ratzinger was just submerging, as the modernists always did when the pressure came.
Well, Your Excellency, Father, you're talking about, we use the term modernism, and you've talked about the specific meaning behind that, but part of that also relates to the idea of, do I have to say something new in theology to be relevant? And I wondered, before this time, were all theologians just bored, repeating the same things from Trent? Well, it's all true, so I don't need to repeat on it. You get this idea from this Nouvelle Théologie that you had to say new things, and only then would you be relevant and worthwhile to read.
No, that's not true. There was, among the scholastic theologians, there was a great deal of work to be done. Many things that had to be researched. For example, whether it was the mediation of Mary of all graces was definable, for example, or the title of co-redemptrix. Those were things that were being researched by theologians, and there was a good deal of controversy about it. Many other things that were still left undone. It should not be forgotten that Thomism was really only the property of the Dominicans for many hundreds of years, and that it became the common explanation of theology only after Leo XIII in the latter part of the 19th century. So the unleashing of scholastic philosophy as the philosophy of the Catholic Church came only a little over 100 years ago, and it was confirmed a great deal by Pius XI, who called St. Thomas the Doctor Communis, meaning the common doctor. He's not only a Dominican, in other words, he's not only a Thomist, he is the Church's theologian. And so this received a great impetus and was attracting great minds. There were the flourishing of Thomism from 1900 to, let's say, 1960 was a wonderful thing for the Catholic Church and presented the Catholic Church in a wonderful light as not only the bulwark of supernatural truth, but also a bastion of true philosophy and giving the true explanation of what is. This was an attempt to. It goes way, way back. It goes back to the 18th century, the idea of altering the Catholic Church to fit the modern world. There has always been a wing of people in the Catholic Church who wanted to make the Catholic Church acceptable to modern man. And they had all of these theories about what modern man is, as if he had substantially changed from the Middle Ages or the ancient world, and that therefore the Catholic Church could no longer speak in the terms of the Middle Ages to modern men, and people would abandon the Church if it did not speak to men in a modern way and with modern philosophy. And so these modernists saw themselves as saviors of the Church, and they were dealt with very harshly by St. Pius X, and some were excommunicated, others were destituted of their offices. But after 1914, when he died, there was a general alleviation of these ways of dealing with modernists, these measures. One of the first things that Benedict XV did in 1914 was to suppress the Sodalitium Pianum, which was Pius X's arm of information concerning modernists throughout the whole world. He suppressed that. He reduced it to being practically nothing. I mean, and it had no power. Whereas it was an extremely powerful thing under Pius X. And so Benedict XV was elected precisely as an anti-Pius X party member. He was elected to mollify the Church's attitude toward the modernists, because a lot of prelates felt that he went too hard, St. Pius X. And this policy of Benedict XV was continued under Pius XI and Pius XII, who were not modernists, but who were soft on modernists. And therefore, these modernists who had to go underneath the ground under Pius X rose up and surfaced and became very numerous after, and active especially after the war, and especially under Pius XII's reign. So this idea of going back, of speaking to modern man and to changing the Church to fit modern man goes back 2 centuries. You can trace it back. But they got their moment in the softness of Pius XII toward them, and of course they had their triumph in John the 23rd, who was a modernist. He was one of them. That's people should understand that this is not something that passing fad. This is something that has deep historical roots.
Wasn't there that anecdote about upon his election going straight to the Holy Office and pulling his file where it says suspected of modernism?
Yes, John the 23rd did that, and that story was told to me personally by Archbishop Lefebvre, and John the 23rd told it to Archbishop Lefebvre personally, so it has very good connections. He went to his file in the Holy Office, and it said suspect of modernism. This was put in by Cardinal Delay under Pius X in 1914, early 1914, when John the 23rd, then the a seminary professor in Bergamo, Italy, a priest, had been summoned to Rome on the accusation, no doubt from the Sodalitium Pianum, that he was using Duchenne in the teaching of church history, Duchenne who was on the Index. And he swore to Cardinal Delay, I do not use Duchenne, I have not even read Duchenne. Now, even his most charitable biographers, including Hebblethwaite, regard this as a lie. That this just was not true. And so I'm sure Cardinal Delay, who was very astute, went and put in his file suspect of modernism, which is very bad. It'd be like saying suspect of murder. It's, in the ecclesiastical world, I mean, if you're a suspect, you're in very bad condition. It's much worse than it sounds. And so John the 23rd laughed it off and said to Archbishop Lefebvre, he said, imagine me, a modernist, and then laughed.
Ironic laughter, I guess.
And he's the one that said to an atheist who was interviewing him, a French atheist, when the name of Pius X came up and the atheist said St. Pius X, he burst out and said, he's no saint. And the atheist said, "Oh, excuse me, Your Holiness, but it is not I who canonized him." And realizing his mistake, he backed up and said, "Oh yes, St. Pius." But his first reaction was he was no saint because Pius X
certainly not to people
him.
like him. Yeah, absolutely.
And John the 23rd's personal and close friend in the seminary was Buonaiuti, who was the principal Italian modernist, excommunicated vitandus by St. Pius X, and who died impenitent in 1943. And he was his assistant at his ordination, Buonaiuti.
Well, Your Excellency, you brought us up to John the 23rd, which takes us up to the council, and with all of the writing and controversy that the young Joseph Ratzinger, and for those of us who are listening, we're obviously not referring to Benedict XVI as Benedict XVI at this time because he was Joseph Ratzinger at the time, Father Joseph Ratzinger. So he got the attention of Cardinal Fring and was brought as a peritus, sort of a consulting theologian, to Vatican II, where he appeared in suit and tie,
which was a scandal at the time.
Yes,
right. The sort of very modern look to the priest that he's going to be a man of the people. Can you talk a little bit about his participation in the council and what his major contributions were? Because we're talking about his legacy, and some of those legacies are unsigned. They are part of some background work.
Yes, so he was a peritus, which is to say a theological expert, and he accompanied Cardinal Frings. Cardinal Frings was an older man and obviously relied quite a bit on this young theologian who had a good reputation in the circles in which he worked in Germany. One of the interesting anecdotes about Frings and Ratzinger is that before the council, the Curia, the Roman Curia, was charged with coming up with drafts, preparatory schema for consideration by the council. These were written very much in the style of traditional Catholic theology, traditional Catholic dogma, very clearly written, and were sent out to different bishops who were on the preparatory commission. One of the ones who objected to it was Frings. He wrote back to say that these schema had to be changed, obviously having in mind completely other direction for the theology of the council. And the schema initially were written in the language of neo-scholastic Thomist theology, but these were not acceptable to him. And of course, the speculation, it's likely since Frings at that time was an old man, is that Ratzinger, the young theologian himself, was the one who prepared the intervention before Vatican II for Frings.
It should also be noted that the German bishops met in Fulda after the early session of Vatican II and came up with a whole set of new schemata to propose if, in the event that the old schemata should be discarded, the Ottaviani schemata. And the author of those Fulda schemata was none other than Karl Rahner, who was a pantheist and a womanizer, a Jesuit priest to boot. And he was the author of those. The German bishops accepted those in Fulda and brought them down to Rome, all set to go, in order to replace Vatican II's schemata, or Ottaviani schemata, the preliminary schemata, with their own. Now, Rahner was the teacher of Ratzinger. Ratzinger is Rahner's altar boy. You have to understand that. He learned a great deal and was very much formed by Rahner. So, in that sense, and he was always seen with Rahner at the council. They were always together, always working together. So, in that sense, Ratzinger very much, through Rahner, hijacked the council, because what happened was John the 23rd wanted these new schemata to be adopted and wanted to throw out the Holy Office's schemata, and so he changed the rules. The rules were originally that you needed a 2/3 vote in order to adopt new schemata, and he changed it to a simple majority. The simple majority passed, and the old schemata were thrown out, and the new ones came in. So that was the beginning of the end of the council. There's nothing that could be done because all of these new schemata were rotten to the core.
Yes.
And we can kind of say we know the story at that point, Your Excellency, not only because we've done that monumental show on the council where we explored 6 of all of the documents, but we know from reading about the council, either Rhine flows into the Tiber or other sources, we know what happened after that. The liberals took over and eventually won. So I guess when you win, you get to go on to your next act. And for Joseph Ratzinger, this was accepting a university position. So for him, it's always been about academics, teaching, writing. He didn't seek a career in church politics. He wanted to just be an influencer, a writer, and he went to the university, which is a natural place for that.
Just another anecdote from Archbishop Lefebvre, who of course was at the council. He said that the left, the Rhine people, all of Ratzinger, Rahner, and all of the theologians and everyone representing that, would every single morning have a mimeographed summary in your mailbox of what happened the day before at the council and what you should think about it. They were very well organized, and they were responsible for the conversion of all of that middle group of bishops, many of them missionary bishops and all, who really didn't know what was going on too much. They put over the ideas of the council they must have worked the whole night to do this, to have them in the mailboxes the next morning, and what you should think. So, I have to think that Ratzinger was very much a part of that because he was part of that whole group. That's very important.
It's impressive. It shows the level of the organization and the determination these people had. Because even from a technical point of view, it was very difficult to get something copied in those days and to get your ideas spread around. So it was a truly extraordinary effort that they made to hijack the council, in effect.
Yeah. Well, you're right, Your Excellency. You some of our younger listeners might have no idea what a mimeograph is.
Yes, it's a very inky, messy machine that uses I won't go into it, but it was used by dinosaurs.
Well, that was also busy churning out the whatever new change you had for the Mass, and you'd stick that inside the missal, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was in the days of typewriters. So, and so that should give you some idea,
Well, that gets us to our post-council period, 1966, beyond, and obviously we have a book you've referenced before, Your Excellency, Introduction to Christianity. That's in 1968. In 1969, we also have the journal Communio, which was a sister journal to Concilium, founded with all the usual suspects. Von Balthasar, de Lubac, and Kasper were all part of that. Can you talk a little bit about this university period from 1966, let's say, to about 1970? What was happening with these books and what was being said?
Well, one interesting anecdote is that, in fact, Ratzinger was appointed to his position because of the influence of Hans Küng. So that should indicate to listeners pretty much where his theological interests at that point lie.
Yes, it was also the time in which Ratzinger supposedly had his conversion, 1968. He was professor at Tübingen, which is just like professor at Liberal U in Germany. It was the home of Bauer and Strauss in the 19th century, who were radical rationalists. I mean, it has a horrible history, Tübingen. Now, it always had a Catholic faculty. The Bauer and Strauss were the Protestants, part of the Protestant faculty, but nevertheless, it had always a horrid reputation for being left-wing. So of course he's named there, and Kung was associated with Tübingen as well. And then, as the story goes, Ratzinger was shocked and appalled by the 1968 uprisings of students, and he then became a conservative. This is what is put forth by his apologists. That then he became a conservative and broke with Küng and Rahner, who were the more radical. And this, it is true that he did see that the pursuit of the radicalism of Küng and Rahner was going to go no place. I don't think it had anything to do with the students. But this is where he took on this sort of coating of conservatism, whereby he would present himself as Mr. Hermeneutic of continuity, that the council and its reforms had to have some connection with the past. That doesn't mean that you would keep the past. It just had to be shown as having a connection to the past, whereas Küng and Rahner were just radicals, break with everything. And so it goes back to that period, and he therefore pursued that and obtained that reputation, all the while retaining all of the modernist theology. He just developed a certain way of speaking and a certain way of presenting his ideas in such a way that that he could present it as continuous. We can't throw out entirely the past. There's statements I quote, and then the whole business in the 1980s of starting to have a conversion toward the traditional Mass and starting to criticize the new Mass, and everything went too fast. And this was all happening in the 60s. Something happened around that time whereby he saw that the path of radicalism was going nowhere.
So would you characterize this as purely opportunistic on his part? He wanted to stay relevant?
Not opportunistic personally, but I think it's always the baby. I wrote an article, Saving the Baby. Their baby was Vatican II. Those liberal and modernist theologians obtained more at Vatican II than they had expected, and Hans Küng said that. It was a tremendous triumph for them. And they realized that this will never happen again, that we must capitalize on this. If ever it is turned back, it's dead forever. So I think it was part of his strategy of what I would call saving the baby, that if the baby of Vatican II is going to be protected, it has to be seen as a homogeneous, that means a continuous development of Catholicism. It cannot be seen as a break with the past. I think in that sense he was opportunist. He sensed that. It was a political idea, but I don't think for personal aggrandizement. No, I don't think you could accuse him of that. I just think he wanted to see this thing happen, and he realized this was the moment.
So as you say, this is when he takes on the veneer of conservatism and starts that slow march to 1981, where we see his appointment as the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is, of course, Vatican II speak for the Holy Office, because we don't dare call things by their traditional names, which would have made him the Grand Inquisitor.
It was always the Holy Office of the Inquisition. So that was its original title. The of the Inquisition was eventually dropped popularly, but it was always the Holy Office of the Inquisition.
So one interesting detail on this is on his appointment is that even conservatives like George Weigel pointed out that he was the first head of the Holy Office who really wasn't a follower of St. Thomas Aquinas. Yes. And that his appointment was really quite a break with the past, a non-Thomas prefect for the Holy Office.
Yes, they were always Dominicans who, of course, ran the Inquisition.
Sure.
Well, this is when he sort of enters our lives. You could say the R being the traditional movement, because we have the 1983 excommunication of Archbishop Took, because those are the only people who need to be excommunicated are traditionalists.
Yes, I think he did some sort of, besides the traditionalists, I think there was some sort of wrath that was sent toward a bunch of nuns or something that decided to be priests. They were on a boat in the Danube, and they had an ordination ceremony. I think he did something nasty to them. But traditionalists definitely got the Inquisition treatment from Ratzinger.
Right, the Inquisition side, not the CDF side.
Right.
The most other people tended to get from him was a warning, a monitum. Yeah.
I think those ladies got a monitum, yes.
So we have the excommunication in 1983, and then we have the broken down negotiations in 1988. So is this the veneer of conservatism, move to traditionalism at its height, this idea of reconciling the past? And can we speak to this? If Ratzinger really is a modernist, then why would he care about reconciling with the Lefebvrists, or why would he care about the traditional Mass?
Because of that very principle, that they are seeking the stamp of approval of tradition. And de Noia said it explicitly in his original letter. I think it was back in November or something, in the fall anyway. There was a letter of de Noia saying the reconciliation of the Society of St. Pius X would be a way of proving the fact that Vatican II is not a break with the past. And if you notice, all of the and Bishop Felle even mentioned this, that the overtures are coming from the Vatican inmates of the modernist inmates of the Vatican. They are not coming from the SSPX. Even recently, there was an attempt to say, well, you have until Friday, that's the day after tomorrow, to come back. Otherwise, we're going to go after each of the priests and try to reconcile them individually.
Maybe they'll send a limo at night with a driver or something. So you have to get in you have to get in the car now, or else.
Yes. I mean, they on the very day, or very close to the very day, that they dumped Bishop Williamson, the Vatican started the whole process up again with some preliminary letter. It was in the Wanderer. It was the end of October. They want the approval of tradition because they understand that they don't want Vatican II to appear historically as rupture. That is the death of Vatican II if it ever appears historically as rupture. And so you see how they went after that Monsignor, I forget his name, that said essentially it was rupture. And they accused him of being a state of vacantist and all sorts of nasty things. What was the name of that Monsignor, Father?
Monsignor Gherardini.
Gherardini. I mean, he had the boldness to say such a thing about Vatican II. And, I mean, he was anathema for that. You're not allowed to say that or think that. The thought police were called out, and the German shepherds and all were sent to suppress that idea. He was
also he was a canon of St. Peter's Basilica, by the way.
Yes.
So
no, he got and his disciple wrote a book saying some very critical things about Vatican II, and he was given some award for it. And the head of the awarding commissions resigned rather than to give this award, to be responsible for giving this award to this author, this Italian author. I forget his name too. But the idea that Vatican II is not continuous and homogeneous with the past is anathema to the modernists, and so vice versa. The idea of attracting if we can get Lefebvre in his successors to nod to Vatican II, that's a wonderful thing. Then the only thing left is the detritus, in their view, of the Sedevacantists.
Well, and when this 1988 collapse happened, I sort of perceived this movement to a middle ground, and that's where, as I was coming up as a young teenage Catholic, I got familiar with the Reform of the Reform, the Ratzinger Report, all of these things that built his reputation in the 90s as this hardcore conservative. And everyone looked to him and said, because by that time, the ground had shifted so much. It's very much like the French Revolution, where the right wing becomes, over time, the left wing becomes regarded as the right wing because the ground has shifted so much. So by this time, relatively speaking, Ratzinger might have been seen as some kind of conservative. Do you still expect that? Do you still accept that characterization?
Well, obviously not. No, it's and you're correct. It is at this point that he starts, I guess, to become more of a household name among Catholics, and you start to read more and more about him in different papers. And there's the great number of books and interviews that he produced. And it's at this point that Ratzinger, becomes a focal point for what we would call conservatives, people who are maybe a little bit nervous about some of the changes of Vatican II and the way that everything is heading, and he starts to look as the great theological hope.
Let me add this, too, that Catholicism does not know liberal or conservative. In the view of modernism, he is conservative in the sense he's a conservative modernist to the extent that he sees that a certain amount of braking needs to be applied as the Cadillac goes down the cliff, so that it doesn't totally crash and burn by the time it reaches the bottom. That it should go a little bit slowly in its gradual progress, so the idea of a conservative. I grew up. There was no such thing as a conservative when I was a child. You were a Catholic. The Pope was Catholic, and the pastor of your church was Catholic. Catholicism does not admit that. So when you say the very word conservative, you are admitting the legitimacy of the liberal and the radical. Mm-hmm. It means that they are all within the same pen, and we just are on different sides, or it's all legitimate. It's something like politics. There's two sides of the same House of Representatives, which side you sit on. This is something alien to Roman Catholicism. It is so. To say, well, he's a conservative. Yes, he's a conservative modernist. I would give him that. He's a modernist, so he's a heretic, but he's a conservative one.
Well, as you say to your earlier point, I guess that's like a conservative murderer.
Yes.
So doesn't use as many knives or something like that.
Yes, is just more surgical, let's say. But it's, for example, Hans Kung would be on the other side. Hans Kung, by the way, is still a priest in good standing. He was taken off the list of the Catholic faculty at Tübingen, that he was not a Catholic theologian. That's all that was done. He is a priest in good standing. Yet Archbishop Lefebvre was excommunicated. Archbishop Tuck was excommunicated. The priests of the Society of St. Pius X are all illegitimate priests in their view. Priests that don't have the right to function, and their bishops don't have the right to function. But Hans Kung, who is a public heretic, I heard him on television say, the assumption is an assumption. So he publicly denied one of the dogmas of the Catholic Church. He is a priest in good standing. That tells you something about the Novus Ordo, that this is a modernist regime that sees heresy as a legitimate thing as long as you play ball according to the rules.
Well, better than good standing. After the conclave, he was invited to dine at the Vatican as a guest.
Yeah, he had a beer with Ratzinger. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It shows they're old friends. If you could, I don't think. I certainly wouldn't be invited in to have a beer with Ratzinger. Let's put it that way.
Well, you'd be bringing wine anyway, Your Excellency.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
So we have the 90s of this household name spreading of the reform of the reform idea that the Novus Ordo was fine, it was just the interpretation and the whole canard of the spirit of Vatican II, etc. Then we get to the 2000s before the conclave, and we have several documents that come out which are very revelatory. And again, going back to the legacy of Ratzinger, there's probably a triangle of things to talk about here, Your Excellency and Father. We've got the joint declaration on justification with the Lutherans. We have Dominus Jesus. We have the document on the Jews in 2001. We have all of that. All of those things tie together with his ecclesiology. And could both of you speak to that, or any aspects of that you'd like to talk about?
Well, certainly one of the big factors of the legacy, one of the big contributions, I put that in quotation marks, of Ratzinger is the ecclesiology. He is a nut about the new ecclesiology. He was very involved in Lumen Gentium, which promulgated the new ecclesiology. This has been very much on his mind, and he has made it the new theology. He has transformed the very notion of the Catholic Church successfully by doing that over the years. So that should be said. That's one of the biggest contributions, and I always use that, of Ratzinger to the destruction of the Catholic Church.
Yes, and biographers say that it was the Vatican II's declaration or revelation and then declarations on the Church that Ratzinger and Rahner worked on together. So this is, if you want to talk about their baby, this is really their baby.
Yes.
And biographers of Ratzinger as well say that his ideas on ecclesiology and his ideas on a different concept of the Church actually go back to de Lubac and his book on Catholicism. So there's, once again, you can see this sort of continuous, continuity, as it were, with liberalism and modernism.
De Lubac, by the way, was cited by the Holy Office for error, and he was rehabilitated later by the modernists.
He was made a cardinal by JP2,
yes,
by John Paul II.
But in 1950, I think it was, or thereabouts, he was, and also the Humani Generis encyclical was against de Lubac. That was one of the preoccupations of Pius XII, to condemn his doctrine. Unfortunately, yes, he didn't go far enough with de Lubac, but that's another story. But de Lubac was the liberal, the modernist on the nature of the Catholic Church, and Ratzinger picked up on it.
It's very interesting to note too that early on in the liturgical movement, that it was recognized that many of the adepts of the liturgical movement in the 30s and 40s had a strange idea of the Church, strange notion of the Church. In fact, in a document in 1947 that Archbishop Grober, one of the German bishops, put out about the errors of the liturgical movement, one of the things that he specifically mentions in there is that these people follow a new and a different idea of the Church that is essentially a modernist idea. So people were becoming aware of that, and the encyclical of Pius XII, Humani Generis, was directed at this idea, and a number of his pronouncements on the Church as well were directed against these false ideas, false concepts of the Church that were being spread by modernists at that time. So it's again, there's this continuity, as it were, with modernism that you see, that some recognized in those days and tried to stop, but were not successful in doing.
See, the key for the modernists was to divorce the Catholic Church from the Church of Christ. They wanted to absolutely do away with the idea that the Church of Christ was essentially associated with the structure of the Catholic Church, that the Church was founded by Christ as a hierarchical institution with Pope and bishops, and in order to be Christian, that is Catholic, you had to belong to this church and be submitted to your bishop, and that if through heresy or schism you were excommunicated or separated from the church, you were completely out and had no hope of salvation. That had to be destroyed, and the various ways in which they destroyed it was an attempt to alter the true doctrine of the mystical body, which is found in St. Paul, into a type of invisible bond between all Christians, all the baptized, and then the Ratzinger's favorite was the church as communion, which is the same thing. He says that the church starts in us and then we build it, which is typically Protestant. He is a modernist who believes that the beginning of revelation is inside of each person, and this encounter with Christ, it begins with each person, and it's a movement of piety and faith in each person. Then the church is built from that. And so the structures of the church are the effect of communion. It is not communion which is the effect of the structures of the church, which is the traditional view. So that all had to be torn down in order to do ecumenism and to amalgamate all religions into one great religion. All that had to be torn down, and to have a freedom of thought and to destroy dogmatic unity in the Catholic Church, because this was their program.
One of the concepts or the buzzwords that we heard endlessly as we were suffering through the Vatican II changes in the post-Vatican II seminary was the concept of the people of God.
Yes.
And this was something that one was suspicious about at the time because of the people who used it. But eventually on reflection, you understand exactly what was going on, that the concept of the people of God was one that the modernists had invented to change, to alter the notion of the idea of the church, that you become a member of the people of God through baptism. And thus, heretics, schismatics, those who are explicitly outside the Catholic Church can still be part of this people of God.
Yes, so Ratzinger says it explicitly in a speech that he gave. He says, speaking of this people of God, he says, one can then ask if the image of the body, meaning the church, was too restrictive, since there manifestly existed in reality intermediate degrees of belonging. The Constitution on the Church found it helpful for this purpose to use the concept of the people of God. It could describe the relationship of non-Catholic Christians to the Church as being in communion, and of non-Christians as being ordered to the Church, where in both cases one relies on the idea of people of God. And he mentions, gives a reference to Lumen Gentium. So what Father Cekada is saying is absolutely correct, that the modernists were using this as a way of breaking down the walls of the Church.
And this is why it is so unrealistic to think of Ratzinger's ideas as somehow conservative, if you want to use that term, or traditionalist in terms of traditional Catholic doctrine, because it isn't. If you look, for instance, in the New Catechism, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so-called, you see that the section on the Church begins with this concept of the people of God. It's the key idea for understanding the new ecclesiology. And it's very, very poisonous, but it was created specifically to serve ecumenism.
Yes, it is a heresy. I did actually a comparison of the new ecclesiology and the traditional ecclesiology in a 3-column piece that I did once. And you should see all of the declarations of popes against this very idea, against some sort of invisible church, or where people outside the structures of the Catholic Church can be considered Catholic, and or members of the church, and they're very, very clear about the necessity to be submitted to the Roman Catholic hierarchy and to be a member of the Catholic Church.
If those who are interested in that article can find it on traditionalmass.org under articles. The comparison Bishop Sanborn is talking about is called the New Ecclesiology Documentation. And so that's on traditionalmass.org underneath articles and under heresies and errors.
And I will post it here on Twitter in just a moment so that we'll have a link to it up on our Twitter feed. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Restoration Radio. Our guests today are His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn and Father Anthony Cekada. Our topic is the legacy of Joseph Ratzinger from 1960 to 2005. And there's still some things we need to cover, Your Excellency and Father, but what I want to make sure we do now is if we have callers who want to call in, that we open up our phone lines. Our telephone number to call is 949-272-9417. Again, that telephone number is 949-272-9417. If you want to skip the queue and put your questions in Twitter, you're welcome to do that as well. Father, you referred earlier about, trad conspiracy nuts, and one of the things that we hear, at least in connection with, at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, was the suppression of the secret of Fatima, a third secret. Do you think that this is something relevant to discuss, or do we feel that sometimes the whole issue of Fatima might be a bit too apocalyptic for Catholics?
Boy, talk about a spiny question.
This will make the phones light up.
Yes, the phones will all light up on this one. Well, first of all, the modernists aren't going to be all that interested in the question of Fatima to begin with, especially since the story is that, in fact, the Third Secret predicted the disaster of Vatican II. And I believe Archbishop Lefebvre told us an anecdote about that as well, that John the 23rd had told him that he read the Third Secret of Fatima, and then just sent it back to the archives because he figured that John the 23rd, figured it would just simply upset people.
He said, it doesn't concern my reign. I remember that story. It doesn't concern my reign. That was his comment to Archbishop Lefebvre.
So, obviously, the modernists are not going to be too interested in it. It could very well have predicted the situation that we're going through. So, naturally, we are interested in it. However, what its contents are not really a key, I think, to what we faithful Catholics are doing now. Because as Archbishop Lefebvre also pointed out in the conference, that Fatima is a private revelation. And as such, even a private revelation that has been approved by the Church, one does not have the obligation to accept on divine faith, that it's a question of human faith. So from that point of view, it is not a key issue for us. But it would be very interesting to know what the Third Secret says.
Yes, and certainly what they revealed and how they interpreted it was absurd, at least in my opinion.
Right, clearly a fabrication, and not even a good one.
Yes, and the interpretation didn't even fit. So some bishop in white and so forth, and dying, and so they applied that to John Paul II, which was absolutely absurd. But just to go back, if we have a moment, to Introduction to Christianity, 1968. This is page 349 of the Ignatius Press book, which I'm holding in my hand. This is what it reads, very short. it now also becomes clear that the real heart of the faith in the resurrection does not consist at all in the idea of the restoration of bodies, to which we have reduced it in our thinking. Such is the case, even though this is the pictorial image used throughout the Bible. He doesn't believe, Ratzinger does not believe, that there will be a restoration of our bodies at the end of the world. This is directly contrary to the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church as expressed in all of its creeds, and is particularly and most explicitly in the Athanasian Creed. Now, I defy anyone to say that that man is a conservative or a Catholic for as long as that statement remains in that book and where it is not retracted.
Well, I would say probably to your point, Your Excellency, you would say until the book is burned in public with music, probably.
Well, how do you call that man a Catholic? How do you call him a conservative when he doesn't believe the Articles of the Creed? My goodness, the Articles of the Catholic Creed. How do you call him a conservative? I'd like to hear somebody tell me that.
Your Excellency, there's always going to be the comment that who are you to judge this man, and you don't have the authority to do so, and the material formal question. So how do you respond to that?
Well, what is clear is that he's a public heretic.
The reproach given to something like that is, well, how do you know what he really meant? How do you know what was in his head? So how many times have we heard that? Why don't you go ahead and answer that one for them? Are we sure that he really meant that? Someone should have warned him about it?
Right, well, this is a novelty not only born of the fact that a lot of Catholics don't understand what the traditional mode was for dealing with heresy and heretics, but because, in modern times, what really matters is your feelings, not what you say.
No, and in all law, including church law, when you commit a crime, you are supposed to be in your right mind and having full knowledge of what you do. It's something like being pulled over by the policeman. He doesn't come up to you and say, "You really didn't mean to be speeding, did you? And you probably your speedometer is probably broken, right?" No. He says, "You were speeding and here's a ticket." You have to talk your way out of it. You have to convince him that your speedometer was broken or that you were distracted or something. You have to prove that you didn't know. But whenever a crime is committed, the public authority always presumes that you were in your right mind and you had no ignorance about what you were doing. And that is the case of the church as well. Father Cekada has an excellent article about that on the website, how the church regards the crime of heresy.
What Bishop Sanborn said is absolutely true. And in the case of a cleric, the authors say that sufficient knowledge of the faith is always presumed, and when it comes to a clear statement, that you are presumed to know what the rule of faith is, but you're saying something contrary to it anyway. And here you have something like the statement about the resurrection of the dead in a book, which was reviewed many times, no doubt, by its author before it was printed. It's clear what he meant.
And are we supposed to believe that this Ratzinger, who was born in 1927, who went to catechism class in the 1930s, is ignorant of the teaching of the Catholic Church concerning the resurrection of the dead? That he never read the Catechism of the Council of Trent? That he never read his catechism? No one ever taught him his catechism? That he never saw the Athanasian Creed? Are people going to present this as an argument in favor of Ratzinger? I mean, please stop us from laughing. It is an absurd argument to say that this man is ignorant.
Well, we have some calls, Your Excellency and Father. So the first one we'll take is from Chris, who's calling from Minnesota. And his question sort of implied in some of the discussion we talked about earlier today, which is Vatican II stronger for the efforts? When I say stronger, let's say more influential. Was Vatican II stronger for Cardinal Ratzinger's efforts? Chris, is that a fair characterization of your question?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I would say that it's his stated goal that in tandem with John Paul II, ever since the two of them kind of ascended to their high office, that they first had to admit that there was now a problem with, first of all, the interpretation of Vatican II, and so that they saw it as their job to clarify that, what the interpretation of Vatican II was, and then to get it implemented and accepted by all, the entire church. So I would ask you, gentlemen, if you would feel that the establishment of the Vatican II religion is now stronger or weaker as a result of Ratzinger's tenure, both in the CDF and as Pope.
Absolutely, yes. I would compare John and Paul to Robespierre in the French Revolution, and then John, Paul, and Ratzinger to Napoleon. It's very comparable. In the French Revolution, you had this big outburst of radicalism, and it would have failed politically if there had not been a Napoleon to take it and spread it all over Europe, and to establish all of the European countries with the new institutions of liberalism and democracy and all of these things that were anathema before the French Revolution. That's John Paul II, in union with Ratzinger, and really Ratzinger is just an extension of his reign, did that. They established it. They soaked the Catholics in this like a marinade. And then at the same time presenting themselves as conservatives and as holding on to tradition. They did a wonderful job of that, just a wonderful job, and that is certainly the legacy of what has happened since 1978 to this day, is the establishment of Vatican II. So I think that to that question the answer is yes, absolutely.
I would say the same thing. You see how the doctrines of Vatican II and the theological mindset of Vatican II has been, for want of a better word, systematized and kind of put together in their new catechism. And this is supposed to be the touchstone for their new world order. And all of it, of course, is based on Vatican II. And so they've solidified it, and then made the attempt to offer an apologetic for it by claiming that it is continuous, that Vatican II is continuous with what came in the past. And Ratzinger himself was the man who came up with the phrase, the hermeneutic of continuity. And in that idea is the buzzword for trying to show the legitimacy and the permanence of this revolution.
When Paul VI died in 1978, there was still time to reverse things. As a matter of fact, Cardinal Siri was supposed to pass as the candidate of those who wanted to reverse things, and the night before, the liberals, who were divided between two liberal candidates, went and got the votes for Wojtyła as their liberal candidate, and he outvoted, or his candidacy outvoted that of Siri. And that's where really the turning point came. And John Paul had a very, very long time as being a modernist inmate of the Vatican, as they call him. He did all of those things, a new code of canon law, many, many documents, and appointments of bishops who were appalling, as we know, and the damage is done. But the damage is done in more ways than one. You can see the condition, as Cardinal Martini said, we have these tremendous churches, but nobody is in them.
Chris, does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely.
All right, well, thanks for your call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Henry from Georgia, and he wanted to ask another question about about the trope of Fatima that we had discussed. Henry, go ahead.
Good morning, Your Excellency, Father Stephen.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call.
Yes.
Yeah, it was funny you mentioned Fatima because I had wrote down there was something, it's in the back of my mind, that either Sister Lucia or the Blessed Virgin commented about 1960 being a critical year or something about clarity, and it just seems like 1960, what was happening in our country, what was about to happen in the church, it just seemed that year had something to do with it. That was one question. The other question is there anything that we can do, we traditionalists can do besides pray, to combat the ignorance, especially of journalists? For example, I just read an article from Christiana Amanpour, quote, Benedict resisted the forces of modernity, unquote. I mean, how ignorant is that? And is there anything we can do other than pray to combat this stuff? Thank you.
I don't think there's anything that could be done for Christina.
I don't think there's anything you can do for a journalist.
Yeah.
Golly.
But yes, 1960 was the year in which all hell broke loose, not only in the church, but also in society, customs, politics as well, but particularly the customs and morals of people and their attitudes. Mm-hmm. It was like the opening of the bottomless pit in the apocalypse. All hell broke loose, and life was totally altered at that point. Yes, I agree with that. Wow. But as far as what traditionalists should do, we have the means to survive. We don't have the means to change the problem in the church, to do anything great to turn it around. We don't have those means. Only God will do that in His good time and way. But we do have the ability to survive and as much as we can to get the word out, and that's what you should do.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
Henry, is there anything else you'd like to ask?
Well, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. It just seems like there is so much similarity between the modernists at Vatican II and the liberal progressives that were in our own country. For example, when John the 23rd changed the vote from two-thirds majority to a simple majority, it kind of reminds me of the Democrats changing the votes in the Senate to get Obamacare passed. They just changed the rules to meet whatever they want. It's kind of very similar to what's happening here in our country.
In general, there is no form of government or form of administration which will resist the evil intentions of those who are in charge.
Yes.
Well, Henry, thanks for your call.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Bye
now. Again, for those of you who are interested in calling and asking our crack clergy your question, our telephone number.
Crack.
Crack. Our telephone number is 949-272-9417. Again, that's 949-272-9417. If you're joining us in progress, you're listening to Restoration Radio. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner. I'm today with His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Father Anthony Cekada. We're discussing the years 1960 through 2005 for one Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. One of the things that happened during this time period, too, Your Excellency and Father, we have, I mentioned earlier, the Joint Declaration on Justification and Dominus Jesus. Now, it's said that the Joint Declaration on Justification is not a magisterial document, so it's not anything we really have to worry about, and it doesn't speak to the illegitimacy of the current Vatican II Novus Ordo sect. How would you comment in response to that?
Well, it doesn't have to be a magisterial document. Introduction to Christianity is not a magisterial document, but it is a publication of heresy. And so is the Joint Declaration a public espousal of heresy in which the Council of Trent was destroyed. All of the declarations concerning justification were put aside and destroyed, contradicted. It's a heretical document, and Ratzinger had a lot to do with it. He's the one that really saved it and put it together. and it is loaded with problems. I mean, it would take a whole interview just to go through that document. Again, that appears on Father Cekada's website. If I did an article on it, if anybody wants to check it.
It's called a critical analysis of the joint declaration of the doctrine of justification on the doctrine of justification.
Yes. And
you'll find it in the Heresy and Errors section of the articles page of traditionalmass.org. That is another. There is a fallacy that unless they say their heresy in the context of magisterium, that they're off the hook. That it's okay to be a public heretic, that this is compatible with Catholicism. And it isn't. It's not compatible with Catholicism or with canon law. It violates both. If you are a public heretic, you overcome the effect of your baptism, whereby you are a member of the Catholic Church, because the profession of faith was the condition upon which the priest would pour the water over your head. And if you abandon the faith publicly, you sever yourself from the Catholic Church, whether or not the law catches up to you or not. If a man murders his wife, he's a murderer long before the law catches up to him. He's innocent before the law, but in reality he's a murderer. And so also a heretic with whom the law has not caught up is in fact a heretic, and all of the effects of his heresy are in place. That is separation from the Catholic Church. Even if it has not been done legally by excommunication, there is nevertheless a true and real separation from the Catholic Church. Cardinal Billot pointed that out, that before the Council of Nicaea, that the Arians were considered to be heretics, even though there was no magisterial statement that Christ was God, in the sense that besides the ordinary universal magisterium, that is the common teaching of the Catholic Church, there was no solemn magisterium that Christ was God. But they were considered heretics because they publicly denied the common teaching of the Catholic Church. And the same is true of these people, just like Ratzinger, denying in his book the creed of the Catholic Church, he becomes a public heretic. And the Society of St. Pius X has put forward the idea that he has to, in order to qualify as a non-pope, he has to solemnly define a heresy. This is not true. No.
They claim that ordinary universal magisterium is something that it can tolerate here and there some error, but in the long run corrects itself. That's their idea of that. And so that there should be ordinary universal magisterium that Ratzinger might put out that is even heretical doesn't really destroy the fabric of the whole thing.
But this is a catch-22
the only way he would qualify is if he teaches it, and that's not true.
Well, and a true pope can't, by definition, issue heresy. He's protected from the Holy Ghost from doing that. So.
Yes. Well, it would be that's the reason why we're sedevacantists, is because it's an infallible sign, even at Vatican II. It's a sign. It's like a red light on your dashboard that something is wrong, that someone who ought to be assisted by the Holy Ghost is not, right? And therefore, I mean, for whatever reason it is, but there's an infallible sign that there's something deeply wrong. And therefore we have to work back and say these people, for whatever reason, were not, in fact, true popes.
But one could say, I guess, that it's the effects of the act, or the effects of the sin of heresy, that you see. And what Bishop Sanborn was talking about earlier with regard to heresy was the difference between a sin that has certain effects as regards taking you out of the church, and a crime which is operation of church law. You're being convicted of the sin, in effect, in an official way. But that's all it is. The reality exists, and the reality has these effects.
I'll give you an example. If your next-door neighbor was known with certitude to be a child molester and murderer, would you say, well, he hasn't been convicted in court, so I'll send my kids over? Of course not. The effect of his crime already takes place by the mere knowledge of it.
Well, we're going to return back to a point you made earlier about there being no such thing as liberal or conservative truly within the Catholic worldview. And John, who's calling us from Wisconsin, is asking the question, was St. Pius X, would he be considered a liberal because he was trying to bring about daily communion? John, is that a fair characterization of your question?
Yes. And then I also wanted to ask if, and by the way, good day to you, Your Excellency, and Father Cekada and Stephen. I wanted to ask if you had used earlier the term invisible church. Now, is that Vatican II speak, and are they supposed to be referring to the mystical body of Christ when they use that term?
I'll answer that. The answer is yes. Yes, the idea is that there are only invisible bonds. Now, the Catholic Church says that there are invisible bonds. There are, this grace and various other supernatural and invisible aspects of the Church, but that these things are in the Church and of the Church. That and by the Church I mean the structure of the Catholic Church. What the modernists want to do is make the structure of the Catholic Church something accidental to the real Church of Christ, which is bound together only by invisible bonds. So that's the difference. The Catholic Church is not merely an organization. It has some very supernatural bonds in it, but the separation of them is the problem.
Thank you.
As regards to the question of the reception of First Communion, how one would characterize that, simply this: it's a question of church discipline. And if you look at the history of the reception of Holy Communion in the Catholic Church, you see that at different periods there were different disciplinary practices for different reasons. And for instance, in the Eastern Rite, a child who is baptized will receive the sacrament of confirmation right away, and then will be given the precious blood. So there's diversity for different reasons in discipline. St. Pius X, decided that in our own time it would be very good for little children to receive our Lord's body and blood. So he changed the discipline there. And that's all. It's not a question of liberal or conservative.
Yes, he also promoted the frequent communion, too. And again, it really is neither liberal or conservative. It's just a pastoral change that really, you could say, well, it's prudent or imprudent, but it has really nothing to do with modernism or anything like that. It's just whether you agree with it or not. And just as a footnote, on the frequent communion, it was the one place in which he and Cardinal Mary del Val disagreed. Cardinal Mary del Val said this is a mistake, that this will lead to the abuse of the Blessed Sacrament, and Pius X ignored him and put it through anyway. So that's just a little footnote to that.
That's new. Thank you very much, both all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Well, I mean, to His Excellency's point, I mean, good men can certainly disagree on items like that, as I'm sure you and Your Excellency, when Father Cekada visits you, you might have a spirited discussion about some theological point. Every now and then.
He doesn't know enough to have a discussion.
I'll get you for that.
Well, when you were talking about Benedict XV, the story is that Cardinal Mary del Val led the group against Benedict XV in the conclave, and that there was this famous story that as Cardinal Mary del Val came up to give his obeisance to the new Pope, Benedict XV leaned forward and said, "The stone that has been rejected has become the cornerstone."
Yes, and Mary del Val, being the extremely intelligent and quick mind that he was, responded with the second part of that verse of the psalm, which was, "And it is wondrous in our eyes." And because Mary del Val had opposed his candidacy for cardinal. That's why you should understand that. Pius X absolutely wanted Cardinal della Chiesa, who was later Benedict XV, to be cardinal. But he was known as a liberal. He was known as a modernizer. And Mary del Val said, "No, don't make him a cardinal. You'll put him right on the track to the papacy." And I think it's the greatest mystery of Pius X's reign, why he made della Chiesa a cardinal. We don't know, but he did. The greatest.
Maybe in the mysteries of politics, you have this idea that sometimes you have to give a little bit so that you don't completely drive your enemies to despair and more desperate moves.
Pius X didn't know the meaning of the word compromise, and if you said that to him, he wouldn't know what language you were speaking. That's why it's so mysterious. I mean, he's the one that said modernists should be beaten with fists.
Well, mysterious mystery, we go back to Vatican II speak, the Church as mystery. We talked about the joint declaration of justification, but now we have to get to the new modern syllabus known as Dominus Jesus, which was one of the Ratzinger creations. I think this was in 2000. And the Wanderer, of course, thought that it was a great show of doctrine. But as usual, Your Excellency, you didn't agree with the Wanderer?
No, the Wanderer occasionally has some good articles, but most of the time I use it to wash the windows of my car. And I don't mean that in a. It sounds pretty nasty, I guess. But their basic idea is no matter what comes out of the Vatican, no matter what, it could be the most horrid thing that happens, everything's okay, and everything's orthodox, and there's nothing to worry about, and it's all glossed over. And I've just seen that over the years. But they occasionally say some good things, and I get to wonder all the time. But the big display of orthodoxy, quote unquote, was that the Protestant churches were told that they are not really churches but only ecclesial communities because they don't have a valid priesthood. And this was, like a jab in the heart to the Protestants. Oh, how could you say such a thing? And this was for the conservatives, a sign to wave the flag and say he has defended Catholic doctrine. It's just a lot of baloney. The reason why he said that was because in his notion of the church as communion, you have to have a valid Eucharist in order to have communion. You see, in other words, in order to be church, I should say, and a legitimate particular church, you have to have a valid Eucharist and you have to have a valid hierarchy. So the schismatics, who are as much outside the church as the Pentecostalists and anybody else that is non-Catholic, and the Anglicans, they are as much outside the church, cut off just as much. They are withered branches on the ground. They, in Ratzinger's view, are particular churches. That means that they have the same status as a Catholic diocese, which was the older term for a particular, or another term for a particular church. That means like the church of wherever you are, the Church of New York, or that was a particular church within the Catholic structure. Well, in that document he calls them particular churches, and he said when they celebrate the Eucharist, The Church of Christ, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ, is realized in all of its fullness. So this is this Eucharistic ecclesiology that was developed by that de Lubac creature in the early 1950s, that wherever the Eucharist is validly celebrated, there you have the Church. Why? Because the Church comes out of the Christian piety. It is an effect of the Christian piety. So if you have the presence of Christ among people, they are church at that point, you see. Then everything is right for being church. And it's just an unfortunate circumstance that, well, yes, the schismatics are not subject to Rome, but, that doesn't prevent them from being particular churches. That means that he took out of the essence of being part of the Church of Christ and being attached to Christ, he took out the papacy and submission to the Roman pontiff as a necessary condition of being part of the Church of Christ. That is a heresy. So that document is heretical for that reason.
I think that's a great point, Your Excellency. I was going to ask Father if he had anything to add to that.
Maybe you thought I was too negative.
Your Excellency, you too
do
negative?
have that tendency. No, that's exactly the point. We're back to the church issue again, and this is how this is what the modernists have done to accommodate ecumenism, is that they have created this different idea of the church, which I think I call Frankenchurch, that it's all of these different and separate parts that are somehow put together by invisible bonds. But it occurred to me as you were talking, Your Excellency, that when the idea of valid orders and of the Eucharist making the church present in all of these different bodies, along around the same time you had another declaration from the Vatican about the Nestorian Church, which did not have the words of consecration in the canon of the Mass, and the Vatican at about the same time as Dominus Jesus issued a declaration saying that this is okay as well. One of the consequences of this particular document, as someone pointed out, would be to allow eventually for Lutheran churches, let us say, to be considered to have some sort of a proper apostolic succession. Because it does away with the idea in a sacrament of an essential sacramental form.
Yes. You see, many Lutherans have retained an episcopacy of sorts. They have Lutheran bishops. They come and do confirmations. And the Anglicans have retained an episcopacy of sorts and actually have succeeded to the traditional episcopal sees in England and so forth. And so they're all set. If they can come up with a theology whereby these people have valid orders, then they have valid Eucharist, then they have a hierarchy, they're all set. Then they're part of the Church of Christ and their churches and their particular churches. And they're not far from that. The idea of matter and form, the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church concerning validity of sacraments, has been thrown out by the modernists. For them, as long as you have a Christian rite in which there is an intention to do something, like to make the Eucharist or to make a bishop or a priest, and you put it in the context of a Christian rite, you're good. You're good to go. That's a valid sacrament. So they, in this next papacy, quote unquote, you could possibly see something like that, where they will approve of Anglican orders with that kind of theology.
Already at the time that the second document we're talking about came out, there were people who pointed that out right away, that this would be a wedge precisely to do that, to recognize the episcopal orders of Lutherans and Anglicans.
Yes. Yes. It's that rite of the Nestorians simply makes a vague reference to the Last Supper. It says Christ, did the Last Supper. That's all you get in it. I looked at the texts, and the reason that they did away with it was because they are Nestorians. That is, they believe that Christ is two persons, and therefore that his human flesh is not adorable. And therefore the idea of a blessed sacrament, which is the body of Christ, the adorable body of Christ, sort of loses its impact in such a theology. Mm-hmm. And so they got rid of the words of consecration and the adoration of the Holy Eucharist.
The people who think we're making this up can find another article on this on traditionalmass.org, and the article is O Sacrament Unholy, also by Bishop Sanborn.
I will try to get a link to that up on Twitter. I have the links up to the other articles that we've been referring to today. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Restoration Radio. Today our topic is on the legacy of Cardinal Ratzinger, also known as Benedict XVI, during the years of 1960 to 2005. And there's still a few things that we want to cover. However, in a sort of summary form, one of our callers has asked if we could get a highlight, what would be, let's say, the top 3 heresies we're looking at from this time period. Magdalene from Florida, is that a fair characterization of your question?
Yes. Hello, Your Excellency, Father Cekada and Stephen.
Yes, hello.
Yeah, I realize you've covered quite a few heresies of Benedict XVI so far, but I was just wondering if you could point to, say, 3 of the most obvious ones, the most glaring that, as Catholics, we have to try to combat it in regular speech with people. And we could just say, well, if you look at this document, it shows these 3 different heresies, and it's indisputable. I'm going to go off air because I don't want my kids screaming in the background.
Thanks for
I guess the child is a good traditional Catholic who'd be offended by the sound of heresies. If we were to mention them, I'm sure Bishop Sanborn would agree with me that the overriding one really is his understanding of the Church.
Yes.
That is so changed. That is unrecognizable from what is traditionally understood the nature of the Church to be. When you profess in the Creed, I believe in one Church, that has a certain meaning, and he has, with the new theology, utterly changed that.
Yes, it's a substantial alteration of the faith. It is heretical. I would say, pulling out his book from 1968 and showing somebody on page 349 a glaring heresy against the resurrection of the dead should be convincing to anybody. I mean, he could not have been more explicit. So if somebody says, well, I don't accept that, or then there's nothing else to say. But that should, if that person has the Catholic faith, that should alarm him deeply. That a person in that position should say such a thing and never retract it. Number 3, there's a lot. I mean, that the joint declaration is so full of heresy. It's one after the other, loaded with heresy on justification. Those are defined dogmas by the Catholic Church. It's very, very clear. Let's see, so many, number 3. Well, all of the heresies of Vatican II you can put on him, especially religious liberty. I mean, he promotes Vatican II as being something that is legitimate, and he maintains the modernist interpretation of Vatican II against SSPX, which is saying we want to put a traditional interpretation, as if that were possible, but at least they're saying we want to interpret this in accordance with the traditional teaching. He has rejected that, and so he has retained the teaching of the modernists, which is the true teaching of Vatican II. So I would put all of Vatican II upon him too, all the heretical teachings of Vatican II.
One of the things that is important to understand is when it comes to heresy or denial of the article, say an article of the Creed, I believe in one church, that if you ask a modernist heretic, well, do you believe in one church? Of course he's going to say yes. But his understanding and his explanation of that is a different understanding, a different sense, a different explanation of that from what the church always had. So the denial of that comes about by adhering to a completely different understanding of what the church meant by that.
And that is a typically modernist thing to do, is to accept all of the dogmas at face value, but to empty out their meanings and alter their meanings. That is typically modernist. So they can recite the credo along with you, but have a totally different idea of it.
Yes.
Well, I think too, Your Earthly and Father, you're going to have, again, the wanderer crowd is going to say, well, yeah, but he wrote that book in 1968. You can't really make him, that was a long time ago. In modern political parlance, like, well, I was younger. I had different views back then. And you pointed out when we talked about this in the pre-show, you pointed this out in our last show when we talked about the resignation announcement, that he has a very je ne regrette rien idea of who he is. He says that he hasn't changed.
Yes, 2003.
Right? That everyone else has changed.
That's what he said explicitly, that he never changed. And it was in an interview in 2003. You can find it on the internet. That everyone else changed, he said, but he has remained the same. So he doesn't, je ne regrette rien, Edith Piaf. And he has, and by the way, heresy does not have a shelf life either. It doesn't sort of expire.
They're sort of like Twinkies.
And, that book was republished. I mean, it isn't as though it's some sort of dead thing that we dug out of a dusty library. It was republished and again reprinted and promulgated all over the place and propounded and whatnot. I mean, this is Ratzinger doctrine. He adheres to these things, and there was no attempt to redact it in such a way that those things were expunged. Not at all. So, I mean, it sticks. There is also the business, a moral heresy of the use of condoms, which is heretical, because it is contrary to the teaching by Casti Connubii that artificial birth control is immoral. And but of course the way the Wanderer handled that was, somebody wrote an article saying that, well, the prohibition against using artificial birth control applies only to marriage. It does not apply outside of marriage. I couldn't believe it when I read it. I just could not believe it. I mean, I practically fell off the chair when I read it, that he's okay because this refers to prostitutes. It's only in marriage that you have to observe those things.
Oh. The modern sport of defending the post-conciliar candidate, claimants to the papacy. Well, I'm glad I opted out of that a long time ago. I just don't have the fitness for it.
Well, I think even for the Wanderer, that was a jolt.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, one of the last things in our timeline, actually, we talked about up to 2005. We also talked about this in our last show, the resignation show. So we don't need to talk about it too much. But if you'd like to reprise the idea of limbo and what happened to that teaching, or what Cardinal Ratzinger would like to see happen to that teaching.
Well, he trashed limbo. He said it doesn't exist, and which involves a number of problems for babies. And again, I have another article. I think it's on Father's site. What happens to babies who die without baptism? if there's no limbo, the reason why theologians said there's a limbo, that is something between the hell of torment and heaven, where is because babies who die without baptism should not obviously go to heaven, and they should not be detained in the hell of torment. So if you do away with limbo, what happens to those babies? Now, before we answer that question, I'll give you St. Augustine's answer. He says, "Wherefore whosoever tells us that any man can be made alive in the resurrection of the dead otherwise than in Christ, he is to be detested as a pestilent enemy to the common faith. Likewise, whosoever says that those children who depart out of this life without partaking of that sacrament shall be made alive in Christ, certainly contradicts the apostolic declaration and condemns the universal church, in which it is the practice to lose no time and run in haste to administer baptism to infant children, because it is believed as an indubitable truth that otherwise they cannot be made alive in Christ." That's St. Augustine on what happens to unbaptized babies. So where do Ratzinger's unbaptized babies go? I can't see Ratzinger saying that they are tormented in hell. So he must be among those who condemn the universal church and contradict the apostolic declaration.
Well, I think that John Paul II made some allusion to this. I don't know if it was in Crossing the Threshold of Hope, but I think his concept is that aborted babies go to heaven, which, I mean, would lead to the logical conclusion that we should be encouraging abortions, not excommunicating people, because they're creating a huge new communion of saints.
Yes. By the way, that was St. Augustine in his letter 166, if anyone wants to look that up, commenting on that. And that's very important because he says he condemns the universal church. That means St. Augustine is attesting to the fact that this is the belief of the universal church. Now, that's a very important testimony from one of the greatest doctors of the church, that this is not his theological belief, or it's some sort of conclusion that he's come to.
Witness to universal ordinary magisterium, right?
Yes. He says he certainly contradicts the apostolic declaration and condemns the universal church. Now, that's very strong from St. Augustine.
Well, I'm sorry, you're saying.
No. So that's important. So I mean, to say that there's no limbo, while he escapes the accusation of heresy because limbo is not taught as Catholic doctrine, he can't escape the accusation of heresy if he says that those unbaptized babies go to heaven. Then he's in heresy. Now, in that, I don't think he addressed it. But, of course, everyone knows, which is typical of the modernists, is that he lets things slide into your mind without actually saying them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Typical of modernism.
The article, by the way, is called "Damning Limbo to Hell." It's also
on the Traditional
Mass Articles site.
Father Cekada has been our faithful secretary today, making notes of those. For those of you who haven't been to traditionalmass.org, it was where I started to encounter a lot of these arguments for the first time, simply because the recognize and resist, you could say the SSPX crowd that I was a part of for a long time, did not really want to get into these issues. There wasn't a thoughtful exploration of Vatican II. There wasn't an attempt to explain the ecclesiology of the crisis, and traditionalmass.org has a lot of these articles, and it's by no means a comprehensive look, but it does encounter a lot of these issues that people have never frankly explored. We've got a little bit of time left, Your Excellency and Father. A couple things I'd like to talk about. One is the 2001 Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible work that was put out by the Pontifical Biblical Commission, with a preface by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. And, of course, this being a very long, modern Vatican document, and most 99% of traditionalists having not read this, can you give us a Reader's Digest, either Father or Your Excellency, on this document and what it means?
Yes, the salient point in it is that one should not make an attempt to convert Jews, and that the Jews have a separate path to heaven apart from the Catholic Church, that the Christian faith, we'll say, in the proper sense of the term, that their covenant with God is still good, that they don't need to accept Christ the Savior and Messiah in order to be saved, that they have their own path to salvation. That's the essence of that document. It was an appalling document because in itself it's apostatical. See, to say that there is a Savior or you can be saved outside of Christ is an apostasy. And yet, that came out and nobody blinked an eye. But it is, and various other statements of Ratzinger and John Paul II as well have corroborated that, and also the heteropraxis of participating in their rites. And I think he said when he went to a Jewish synagogue that we hope that God helps you to continue your mission. I mean, what mission is there outside of Christ? How do you have a mission? A mission from whom? There is this idea that and also he said that the Jews do not await the Messiah in vain. Now, these are all statements of Ratzinger, so I'm just putting it all in context. He has this idea that. It's funny. Just as again a footnote to this, I was in a bookstore, a Catholic bookstore in Paris, not too long ago. And I saw the scripture section, and usually, you would see New Testament and Old Testament, and the way it read the sections instead of Old and New, it said First Testament, Second Testament. And I noticed that, and I thought, well, there it is. That the First Testament is still around, and there's a Second Testament for the Gentiles or something, so Ratzinger has this idea that they are somehow exempt from the first coming of Christ, but they'll get on the bandwagon, so to speak, at the second coming of Christ. If you read, things that he has said, that prayer that he put in the 62 Missal for Good Friday expresses that. I don't know if the SSPX, out of obedience to the Holy Father, uses that on Good Friday. It would be interesting to see what they do.
Well, he's only the Holy Father when he doesn't disagree with that.
That's right. Yes, he's always right unless he's wrong.
We're sort of setting the stage, obviously, as the claimant Benedict XVI. Ratzinger entered a synagogue to pray with the Jews, and at the end of that service, there was a hymn sung for the coming of the Messiah, and Benedict was photographed bowing his head during the song. So there's obviously actions that would play out in the non-pontificate that we would have ahead of us. One more thing I want to talk about that will kind of set our stage for our next show, Part 2, the 2005 through 2006 to 2013 timeline for Cardinal Ratzinger, is Assisi. And this goes back again to the idea of traditionalists holding on to their gossip. So this idea that Cardinal Ratzinger was opposed in pectore to Assisi, but he didn't stop it. And yet, if this were really true, we wouldn't have seen that he actually participated in his own version of this event during his own non-pontificate. So do you, Father, or Your Excellency, do you have any comments on the 1986 Assisi event and what Ratzinger's role or non-role in this? What does it imply? What did it mean?
Well, I mean, as far as 1986, it's the abomination of desolation in the holy place. It's the only way you could describe it. And Ratzinger was not there, and there was this idea that he was staying away because he didn't really agree with it. But we know that's not true because he praised the spirit of Assisi when he inaugurated the one that happened in, I believe, 2011, and the 25th anniversary of it. So, and other points he praised the spirit of Assisi. So, he must have had a cold or something like that for staying away. I don't think it was anything theological. But that requires, yes, a whole other show to deal with that. But certainly all of his principles agree with that. All of his principles of ecclesiology and his principles of finding God by in yourself, which is very clear in his introduction to Christianity, where man makes an approach to God by discovering the absolute in himself, which is practically straight out of Pascendi, which is the document of Pius X, which condemned modernism. It is practically word for word. It's as if he went and copied it. It's pure modernism. So therefore, when people worship a Buddha, or they at one of them, yes, that was 80. No, it's one of them. They had the worship of fire, which was the original idolatry that is mentioned in the city of Ur, that Abraham was drawn away from by the command of God. So they had the worship of fire. They had to do it out in the courtyard because obviously it was a little bit dangerous to do it in the basement of the basilica. But all sorts of evil forms of worship were taking place there. But that's all, it's all in accordance with their theology.
Well, Your Excellency, Father, thank you. Time has sort of flown by. We're at the end of our show, and for those of you who are joining us now at the very end of our show, don't worry. When the show wraps, the stream will be collected into a podcast that you can download, so you can start the show over from the beginning and get what you missed. This has been Restoration Radio, and we've been talking today about the legacy of Joseph Ratzinger from 1960 to 2005. Our next show on this topic, Part 2, is going to be next week in the United States. Time will be February the 27th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to be talking about the years 2005 through, you could say, the beginning of 2013 up till, because that will be the day before the resignation and when the entire world will be set of a contest for at least a period of time. I guess there will be a period of peace, a period of time. And our guest today will be the same on that show as well. We'll have His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, who's rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary. For those of you who are grateful to hear a Catholic bishop talk in a Catholic manner with fellow Catholics, let your gratitude be known either by thank you notes or thank you notes which have monetary contributions to His Excellency. The seminary address is Most Holy Trinity Seminary, 1000 Spring Lake Highway, Brooksville, Florida, 34602. Again, that's 1000 Spring Lake Highway, Brooksville, Florida, 34602. And as I've said before, no contribution is too large. Father Cekada is at St. Gertrude the Great. His address is 4900 Rialto Road, Rialto Road. That's in West Chester, Ohio, 45069. As I said at the top of the show, Father has a new website today that's out called sggresources.org and has links to all sorts of resources, including His Excellency's Seminary and some other media and books which you should explore and learn about so that you can have a better understanding of some of the things that we're talking about on the show. Restoration Radio is a production of True Restoration Media, which sponsors the show. If you'd like to know more about what we do, you can find us at truerestorationmedia.com and my writing, Stephen Heiner, at truerestoration.blogspot.com. We hope you'll join us next week. Your Excellency and Father, thank you for your time. And
thank
we will
Thank you.
We will close out the show with how we started the beginning with a cut from Palestrina's Tu Es Petrus.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.